Okay. Yes. I think we are on. Welcome everyone to our second event in our Philosophy Talk series, organized by the Department of Philosophy at Marmara University. Today we are more than happy to have with us Professor Giovanni Giorgini. Welcome. Professor Giorgini is Professor of History of Political Thought at the University of Bologna and an adjunct professor of Political Science at Columbia University. He is a life member of the Clare Hall College, Cambridge, and he has been a fellow of the Italian Academy at Columbia University and a visiting professor in many universities in the United States, such as Princeton, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. Also in Italy at Bolzano and IMT Lucca. He's the author of many books published in Italian. One of them is La città e il tiranno. Hopefully I'm saying this correctly, which could be translated as The City and the Tyrant. Also the author of Liberalismi Eretici, Heretical Liberalism, and I doni di Pandora, which is the gifts of Pandora, I think would be translated as. He's also the author of a translation with introduction of Plato's Politicus. With Elena Herrera, Professor Giovanni, he has edited The Roots of Respect, where he also contributed an essay on respect in ancient Greek poetry. With Dino Piovan, he has edited the Brill Companion to the Reception of Athenian Democracy, where he contributed an essay on Leo Strauss' recovery of ancient political philosophy. He is the author of numerous essays on ancient political thought and contemporary liberal theory, translations and entries in encyclopedias. Today, he's going to be talking on relativism, the view that all knowledge is relative to some percipient subject and that there is no universal objective truth. So please join me in welcoming Professor Giorgini. The floor is yours. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and for this very kind presentation. Also, my compliments for your excellent pronunciation of Italian, sorry. I'm very happy to be here to share my thoughts on relativism with you. I thought that for a philosophical audience, what I could offer was something that combined my dual interest in ancient political thought and in contemporary liberal and democratic theory. So I want to tackle what I consider one of the most interesting and most urgent philosophical notions that is around now, that is to say, the relativistic idea that every truth is inevitably connected to a time and a place, to a society and an epoch, that there are no objective truths, and therefore we are devoid of any standard by which we can evaluate claims coming from different cultures. You will see I will tackle this problem both historically and theoretically. I think by looking at the contemporary literature on relativism, what is striking is the use by such authors as Alasdair MacIntyre or Martha Newsbound of classical notions. In the case of Newsbound, she speaks of a moderate Aristotelian essentialism. So I want to go to the root of the problem, to examine when this idea of cultural relativism was first proposed, look at what the contemporary authors had to say to counter this notion, and then move to our contemporary age and see if we can use some of the insight we can get from these ancient authors to find, a possible solution. What I'm going to tell you is my current research. So this is, a tentative idea on how to counter relativism. Before telling you what my solution is, I want to add that I think that we should take relativism seriously. We should take it seriously both as a philosophical doctrine and as a political notion. Relativism is not to be simply discarded as self-refuting. Relativism obviously has its charm. So what I will try to do is to take relativism seriously, but at the same time show that relativism cannot work in practical life. So that said, I think that relativism, and my definition is that the view that all knowledge is relative to some percipient subject and that there is no universal objective truth, is itself a product of the advancement of knowledge. Historically, it was most likely the result of a generalization of some observations made by Greek mariners and merchants. Laws and customs in distant and not so distant countries were different from, sometimes opposite to, those of the Greeks. Knowledge of other people's different religious beliefs, legal systems, and political arrangement questioned the previously firm belief that human society and its arrangement were a reflection of the order of the universe. This beautiful and ordered universe, cosmos in Greek, which, as you know, means ordered universe. Interestingly enough, this realization prompted one Greek-speaking thinker, not born on mainland Greece, to compose a historical treatise revolving around the notion that custom is the king of all things. And this is Herodotus. And another one to create a theory according to which knowledge is perception and therefore singular and individual, to the grand conclusion that man is the measure of all things. And this is obviously Protagoras. Other daring thinkers followed in, arguing that there was thus an obvious contrast between what is valid by nature, always and everywhere, and what is valid by custom or law, and is therefore situated in a specific time and place. From a notion about knowledge, relativism quickly and naturally expanded into a full-fledged theory about everything: moral values and standards of justification, education and civilization, political arrangements, the existence of the gods. Since its inception, relativism has always had a special charm. It places the human being at the center of the universe and makes them a dominator of experience, a creator of values, the ultimate arbiter about everything. The relativist is also very fair and polite because they grant the same godlike status to their neighbors who might have quite different opinions. Who is the relativist to judge? And by the way, with what standard? The first and most consistent relativist theorist, the Greek sophist Protagoras, claimed that man is the measure of all things, and this statement was hailed as a grand intellectual achievement by his contemporaries. Relativism, in its various guises, has resurfaced and has been popular in philosophy in different ages. Today, globalization, multiculturalism, post-colonialism, and other similar phenomena have revamped the popularity of relativism, especially in its cultural version in Western countries, and prompted a response from different intellectual authorities that range from the conservative Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, who is also a keen theologian, and the Catholic Church, to the radical liberal theorist Martha Nussbaum. Responses to relativism have, since antiquity, typically taken two forms. Some authors, like Plato, have taken relativism seriously and have focused on its theoretical claims, finding in it a major flaw. If it is a consistent theory, then it is self-refuting. This is Plato's bottom line against Protagoras in the Theaetetus. If every theory is both true for those who uphold it and false for those who deny it, also the relativist statement is included, and the truth of relativism cannot be absolutely established. There are no objective reasons to believe in relativism because nothing is objective but always relative to, if we wish to be consistent. End of story. Some other authors, such as Aristotle, have had less patience with relativistic statements. If someone is persuaded that everything is both true and false, they cannot be serious, and it is therefore pointless to argue with them. Aristotle says they are like plants. They say nothing, and we should not waste our time with them. Moreover, Aristotle's essentialism, his belief in the existence of a single human nature, enabled him to avoid the perils of cultural relativism. While disparaging its theoretical background, Aristotle found a more serious problem with relativism: its practical consequences. Nobody can afford to live like a relativist, and in fact, Aristotle argues, nobody does. If you think that the statement "throwing yourself down a ravine is dangerous and potentially fatal" is both true and untrue, why don't you try the experience? Well, for obvious reasons. So relativism is inconsistent. And it is exactly this obviousness, this inconsistency that I wish to investigate in my paper. Granted that truth is relative to any one of us, why do we all, and I imagine especially lady relativists, prefer a kiss from Brad Pitt to a punch from Mike Tyson? Why are the reasons for longing to be kissed by Brad Pitt and fearing to be punched by Mike Tyson so obvious? Why is it that oysters are considered better than cat food? Why is it that no one, not even cultural relativists, who presumably believe at least that their theories are true, actually live as such? So I propose to investigate first the relativist claims about knowledge, and then the stance taken by moral and cultural relativists. While examining the inconsistencies of the relativist theoretical position, I will also explore the appeal of relativism in contemporary multicultural societies, in order to show that the same inconsistencies can be detected also in their stance in practical matters. I wish to show that beyond the singular, a unique world of every relativist, there is a common world in which we all live, characterized by regularities and implicitly acknowledged standards. Relativism, although an attractive theory for its deconstructionist slant, is untenable as a general look on reality and as a practical guide in our ordinary life. So, the relativist typical first move is to point to the fact that the same things appear different to different people, who have therefore conflicting opinions about almost everything. This is easily shown concerning perceptions and physical states. Theoretically, you may consistently argue that the sensation of coldness produced by the breeze on our feverish body is just as true as the sensation of warmth the same breeze produces on other people who happen to be healthy. After all, you are shivering and no one can persuade you of the contrary, because it is actually against your bodily evidence. Truth, it may be argued, is relative to every percipient subject. You may conclude, like Plato, that sense perception gives you an unstable knowledge, and you have to look elsewhere for a more secure one, not based on objects of sense perception. You need reason, and in this respect, all men are not alike, for some are better reasoners and judges than others. Or, if you wish to save the appearances, that is, the data coming from your senses, while striving for more exactness, you may invoke, like Aristotle, a more precise standard of judgment than just any human being, such as, this is Aristotle's notion, the sound human being, who, in my example, is the healthy human being. This notion, however, is tricky because while it purports to describe a mental and physical state, it is actually replete with value judgments. Who is the sound or normal human being? The average human being, the projection of the majority of the population at a certain time, the ordinary human being? Briefly, when it comes to knowledge of objects of sense perception, the best answer to the relativist is in an Aristotelian vein. If I know that by pressing my eyeball, I can alter my perception and see two candles instead of the one standing in front of me, this knowledge influences my interpretation of what I perceive. So, we look for better explanations, and we are constantly revising our belief systems in search of more accuracy. Even discoveries like Werner Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy actually increase our knowledge, for they make us aware of the pitfalls and the limits of our search for knowledge. In addition, we may point to another theoretical problem with relativism. Sense perception is singular and related to an individual. It relegates each of us into a world of one's own. Likewise, if our opinions are not tested and contrasted with those of other people, they confine each of us into a separate world. For if we maintain that there is no other standard of truth beside ourselves, we are all owners of singular truth that cannot be communicated to others. This is the consistent conclusion that the other giant sophist, Gorgias, drew and conveyed in a dramatic statement. Nothing is, even if it were, it would be not it would not be knowledgeable, and in any case, what is cannot be communicated to others. This is still the case for consistent relativists who inhabit private, singular, separate worlds in a situation of incommensurability and untranslatability made familiar to us by Alasdair MacIntyre. Nowadays, it is especially moral and cultural relativism that holds sway because of the strong migration fluxes and the exposition to different cultures, not mediated by that typical attitude of Western superiority, which was still dominant until a century ago. So by moral relativism, I intend the family of theories that maintain that there is no objective standard of what is good, and that values are inevitably linked to a historical framework or are the product of emotions. By cultural relativism, I intend the doctrines that maintain that values are always the product of a culture or a society, and therefore are inevitably historically and geographically located. And in addition, that they are incommensurable, and any attempt of such transcultural evaluation is doomed to turn into cultural imperialism, or simply irrelevancy. So, the problem of relativism in liberal societies, when applied to practical matters, is still more interesting and commands our attention for its consequences. Should we leave the decision about the truth or exactness of the evolutionary theory to what the majority of people in a country think, or to the average Joe, or to the specialist? What is, for instance, the standard that should act as a guide to the judges in the American Supreme Court in their decisions concerning hotly debated values such as the human life? Do value judgments rest on any solid objective ground, or are we to conclude that the conflict between the gods presiding over values is unsettable by human reason, as Max Weber did? To respond to these questions, I think that an Aristotelian perspective is still the most fruitful and promising. What Aristotle found grossly wrong and extremely irritating was the fact that a relativist is in principle committed to the notion that everyone has their own concept of truth, and consequently, everyone says the truth. But since people often have opposite ideas on the same subject, everybody says also what is false at the same time. And even this statement is for them false. As a consequence, it's impossible to have a discussion with a relativist, because such an opponent actually says nothing, and reality and fancy are inevitably identical for them. This is the metaphysics. More problematically, Aristotle continues, why does such a person actually go to Megara to do business instead of simply resting at home and thinking that he's going there? Or why doesn't he throw himself in a well if he really thinks that this action is good and bad at the same time? So, relativism cannot be adopted as a theory in our practical everyday life. I have to say that Aristotle here, in my opinion, does not give a fair treatment to Protagoras. Because if we read especially Plato's Theaetetus, we realize that Protagoras does not leave us devoid of a standard. Protagoras says that, sure, man is the measure of all things, but in practical matters, certain men, namely the very well-educated man, the sophists, are better measures than others. Certain truth, to put it in the provocative way that outraged many of his contemporaries, are better, although not truer than others. The well-educated man's judgments work better, although we may not claim any superiority for their truthfulness. So in modern terms, the question whether human rights are objectively true or the product of Western civilization would be answered by Protagoras or by a follower of Protagoras simply by, but they work. The Protagorean would invoke the adoption of a consequentialist perspective and argue that we should look pragmatically at the consequences of our judgments. In countries where human rights are recognized, people enjoy a better quality of life than in countries where they are not recognized. People from these latter countries flee for some reason to the former countries. So the clever Protagorean accepts relativism as a conception about our possibility to establish what real knowledge exactly is. But they believe that in practical matters, not all opinions are equal, and wisdom acquired through education makes the difference. Truth, as Nancy Cartwright would say, does not explain much. The wise individual, then, leaves truth aside and judges according to the consequences of actions. A political arrangement that works better than another is certainly superior. This means that relativism, right from the very beginning, included a non-relativistic approach to practical matters, where valued judgments are necessarily to be uttered, and when human conduct is at stake. So, I believe Protagoras, the first consistent relativist theorist, had already an answer to the practical consequences of relativism. When it comes to practical matters, truth is what works. How can you say that something works? You look at the consequences. So, the fact that people have diverse images of the good, diverging political preferences, different religious beliefs, and conflicting opinions about most everything does not mean that all opinions are of equal value, nor that all should be tolerated. I have the impression that certain grand and astounding relativistic statements in moral and political theory amount to unrefined versions of Hume's famous saying that it is not contrary to reason for me to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the smallest injury to my finger. The Oxford philosopher Stuart Hampshire has already done justice to such paradoxical but appealing statements under the name of false isolation or Hume's trick. Hampshire rightly pointed to the fact that such strange normative sentences, like other singular counterfactual conditional judgments, abstract from, I quote, the normal presupposition of the expected constancies in the world. In making statements about the world, just as in regulating our conducts, we always presuppose some, I quote, very general and unspecified ceteris paribus clauses, Namely, we presuppose that both the natural world and the social world are proceeding normally. It is exactly this notion of normality, of what is usually the case, that we should bear in mind and use against the relativists and their bold statements. In our everyday practices, to borrow a Wittgensteinian notion, there are constancies, regularities that would be foolish to neglect or cancel in the name of skepticism or relativism. So, once we turn to political matters, this translates into the notion that there are historically constancies and regularities in human conduct. Every time we imagine a good arrangement for our society and we identify a brick for our construction, such as the free, rational, and reasonable individual, that's John Rawls, or a political animal, Aristotle, or a sovereign consumer, the Chicago School of Economics, or a maximizer of utility, or a homo economicus. We are isolating features from the ordinary human beings. We are all, at times, all such things, sometimes rational, sometimes irrational, sometimes selfish, sometimes unselfish, sometimes heroes, sometimes scoundrels, sometimes wise, sometimes otherwise. We need a more historically accurate and sensitive brick, something that captures the complexities, but also the constancies of human beings in real life. So, to move towards a conclusion, I want to remind you, and this tells something about my age, obviously. Instead of making a very elaborate quote, I want to remind you of a famous song of my childhood in the 70s, the Pink Floyd, Us and Them, from the album The Dark Side of the Moon, 1973. You remember the song starts, us and them, and after all, we are only ordinary men. I use this because pop culture, as the name goes, is popular. The idea that if I say we are all ordinary men, those were the 70s, obviously not, they meant human beings. We all understand what an ordinary man or an ordinary human being is. And I find it interesting that the notion of the ordinary man, which should be read as the ordinary human being, comes to the fore when we want to draw a distinction between us and the others. The ordinary man is a cultural construct, but not an inane or merely ideological one. It is linked to a society and a civilization that is to a time and a place, but has features that go across history. And this is why we can recognize the ordinary human being even from afar. It is also a normative concept, not just a descriptive expression. For it is a projection of an entire culture's image of the best traits of a human being. In this sense, it is extraordinary in its ordinariness. It is not a fiction because it is based on the features of real human beings living in that society, on a character that is so familiar to everyone, our neighbor, the ordinary person. It contains, however, an element of idealization of the best traits of a culture, It is recognizably one of us, but only when we are on our best behavior. The notion of the ordinary human being prescribes what good traits you require in order to be a trustful person, a good citizen, and one of us. Cultural identity is created through a continuous process of incorporation and exclusion. In the making of an individual's or society's identity, some features are accepted and included, and some are discarded. When the process is completed, some possible alternative identities are rejected. And so the us and them story begins. So, if you look at our contemporary liberal societies, I think a good starting point is Martha Nussbaum's famous seminal essay, Human Functioning and Social Justice. Nussbaum, in that essay, started by recounting a personal experience at a conference with some French cultural relativists who, in the name of politically correctness and respect for radical otherness, stoutly defended traditional practices which appeared ill-grounded or even disgusting to Nussbaum and most of the other participants. So Newsbound concluded that in the name of just ideals, even progressive, well-meaning intellectuals find themselves defending abominable practices, ancient religious taboos, and economic measures that condemn the recipients to underdevelopment because of their relativistic views. So, in modern politics, we see that relativism seems to be a solution to the diverse values that we see when we look around. The Scottish philosopher Alistair MacIntyre has concluded that in contemporary liberal societies, what we experience is actually a civil war conducted by other means. I believe that this conclusion is unduly pessimistic. Why? Again, because I believe there are certain constancies in human societies and in human behavior. And this notion of the ordinary human being can help us. This notion, the ordinary human being, had a place in the Roman legal code. And it was called the pater familias, the father of the family, who was the subject of the legal code. What is already interesting for those who love classical culture is that the pater familias, the father of the family, need not be a man or a father. It was an idealization of the person who acts with the prudence and discretion that is typical of a father, of someone who has children and who thinks of their well-being. Interestingly enough, this notion has a place also in the law codes of many countries, including the United States. It's not called the pater familias, it's called the prudent man rule, and it's used especially in business transactions. It is this notion has been established by an opinion of the Supreme Court in the middle of the 19th century. In bankruptcies, in trustees, and other cases, the administrators are expected to adopt the prudent man rule, the prudence that is typical of an ordinary man. So, I believe that when we encounter disagreement and conflict, we may appeal to this notion of the prudent human being, which is not a social construct that varies with different cultures. It therefore defies relativism. Everyone has an intuitive image of what it means to be a prudent person, just like everyone has an intuitive knowledge of how to drive a car. However, becoming a prudent human being is a matter of education and habituation, a long process that requires interaction between individual and society, a process whose conclusion is the ability to make the right decision according to the circumstances. So, I wish to conclude on an Aristotelian note. In the Politics, Book 5, Chapter 9, Aristotle argued that the best way to secure the stability of constitutions is a system of education suited to the constitutions. Aristotle emphasized the central importance of education in supporting a form of government, a means that he considered neglected by legislators already in his age. At the same time, he remarked that this education should aim at creating good citizens in relation to the specific form of government. There is not, in his view, a universally applicable perfect education. But this surely does not mean that citizens should be indoctrinated into acceptance of the regime in which they happen to live, for there is no education to tyranny, for instance. What it means is that there are many good or acceptable regimes, and that education in the values embodied in the Constitution contributes both to the flourishing of the citizens and to the stability and goodness of the political community in which they live. We should be aware of these limitations and realize that liberal societies are identified by certain values that are certainly the product of a historical process and of contingent circumstances, but are also susceptible to become universal. Liberal education means exactly education and habituation in these values, embodied in a constitution and in liberal practices and institutions. In this perspective, it seems obvious that liberal education, which aims at creating autonomous and complete individuals, endowed with critical reasoning, must recognize that it pursues the ideal of creating a liberal human being in the old-fashioned and most elevated meaning of the word. This education aims at creating a liberal, not a neutral identity in the citizens, extolling critical reasoning and rationality, respect for the individual as an absolute center of value, the consequent defense of personal freedom and of toleration of diversity are all liberal values. But this does not mean that they cannot be made universal or universally acceptable. Pythagoras' theorem was discovered by a Greek, but does not apply only in Greece. I cannot, therefore, agree with John Rawls' view of liberalism as a theory which is neutral toward values and that finds truth to be a divisive notion. The recognition of the historicity and situatedness of liberal values and the consequent rejection of the dream and the hypocrisy of liberal neutrality do not entail diminishing the value of liberal education, On the contrary, it means exactly to see in it a value and not a fact or a neutral entity. Liberal education is the first requisite for the maintenance and the improvement of the liberal state, which is not the best of all possible states, but has so far proved to be superior to all others in one respect. If you don't like it, you are free to leave it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this rich, all-encompassing also talk, touching on various issues concerning relativism. So the floor is now open for questions. I have on the screen the YouTube link. So if any questions appear there, I will be able to see them hopefully. Let me check my connection. It should be working. As we wait, let me just bring up a certain interesting issue. As I listened to you, it seemed almost like relativism is also a way for non-relativism, so to speak. In other words, it seems to consist of like a fine-tuning towards the seek for truth, because since relativism incorporates the fact that there are other points of view, of course, when we seek for truth, the recognition of that is a part of seeking knowledge. Would you agree?
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely. And I think that the greatness of Protagoras was exactly in realizing what you said, that, relativism argues that there are no truths, but at the same time, when it comes to practical matters, living our lives, certain opinions, certain beliefs are better than others. And so I think Protagoras arrived really at the root of the problem. The problem is the notion of perception. I think an idea that he got from the medical school. And his idea was very much in line with the discoveries of contemporary physicians. When somebody is sick, they have a different perception of things. And so what is the true perception? Protagoras was smart in arguing, obviously, if you are shivering, I cannot persuade you that it is warm. You are shivering, but I can persuade you that your truth, he used this word, I believe, in order to provoke his public, his audience. Your truth is not as good as the truth of the physician. So Protagoras himself found a solution to relativism in practical matters. Very famously in the Theaetetus, Protagoras argues that what justice is the opinion of the city. So in contemporary times, this means that the United States, Turkey, Italy have different notions of justice, and we cannot question their validity. But Protagoras would say, a person like a sophist who has traveled around the world can tell you that in certain countries you live better than in other countries. So, and this can be, I believe, applied to many other problematic notions nowadays. Racism, for instance, or the inequality of men and women. A Protagorean would say, I don't question the truth of your idea that a race is superior to another. I only point out that this doesn't work in practice. Places where there is racism are places where the quality of life is inferior.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see now the questions, so I'm going to have a look at those. There's, of course, Idealization thanks you, Professor Giovanni, for this comprehensive presentation on relativism, and he has two questions. The first one is, based on the cultural differences, we talk about epistemological relativism, particularly moral relativism. However, in recent times, globalization more and more drives these cultural differences into a uniform cultural globe. Can we say, he says, that this process leads us to create a universal moral system? So that's the first question.
Mm-hmm. I don't think so. I don't think so because I believe that globalization on the one side has globalized, that is to say, has made known to the entire world certain ideas, certain values, certain ways of life, but at the same time has emphasized the differences between people. What I see is that now there is a renaissance, a revival of localism, of the notion of cultural identity, the notion of cultural rights. You know, I find these respectable idea, but they all go against the idea that it's possible to have a universal morality or a universal outlook. And my conclusion was very much in this sense. Obviously, as you have heard, I like liberal values, and I believe liberal values are, on the one side, historical. They have been created by a civilization. But on the other side, certain liberal ideas can be made universal. So, for instance, the notion of religious tolerance or equality of men and women, I think that historically have been developed in certain countries like England, for instance, but they can be made universal. Mm-hmm. And this is what I expect from liberal theories. And this is why I read John Rawls, and I consider him a great author, but I completely disagree with this idea that liberalism is neutral. Liberalism has always had certain founding values since its inception. So the answer is no.
Okay. And his second question is, he says, I think that relativism is based on the idea that subject is completely an engaged self, not a disengaged self. Are the thinkers that defended relativism sure about that? He goes on to say, if we are not an engaged self to some extent, we can eliminate epistemological relativism and defend the possibility of any universal knowledge, whether moral, political, or metaphysical.
This is a very interesting idea, and it is very well articulated. But I'm afraid I don't agree with this idea. My conclusion is very much in the line of Protagoras. I believe that this notion of, the ordinary human being is a notion that can help us because it is both, to use the words of, the person who posed the question, both engaged and disengaged. It belongs to a culture, a civilization, a certain cultural milieu, but at the same time is a universal abstraction. I think that at all latitudes, we can identify with, little differences, what is a prudent behavior? What is a wise behavior? It has certain small differences based on different cultures, for sure, but generally speaking, I think it's based on the recognition that certain things have always been considered evil by all human beings. This is something I left a bit in the background of my talk, but I think the only solid ground on which we can build is the recognition that, no matter what a relativist may say, certain things, death, starvation, incarceration without due process, have always been considered evils in all societies. So it is not true historically that everything is up to discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a more, perhaps, question on a more fundamental basis. When I think about consciousness, since I work in that field, consciousness by its nature has to do with how things seem to a certain subject. So the domain is about how things appear to the subject rather than how things are. I was just curious about how you would place the notion of relativism within the subject of consciousness. Would there be such a thing as relativism? Because it seems to lose its significance, I mean, relativism as opposed to something else, since, as I said, the domain of consciousness has to do with how things appear to a point of view, to assert someone's perspective.
Thank you. Well, this is a philosophical question which has, in my opinion, a practical import, because consciousness plays a big role, for instance, in the legal system. If you think about, trials, when there is, in the courtroom, the judges have to make a decision and they listen to witnesses. Witnesses base their accounts on their conscience, on the way they have perceived, seen, heard certain things. And we know they cannot, sometimes they say different things honestly, I mean, not. And so this is a problem. And I think it is similar. This is why I evoked Werner Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy, because I believe that in the case of consciousness applied to practical matters, we can only approximate the truth. So we must have an approach which is modest, so to speak. That is to say, it acknowledges that we cannot achieve the absolute truth about consciousness. This is why we should listen to different witnesses, and in the end, it is a matter of decision.
Mm-hmm. Almost a practical decision, I guess, also.
Yes.
All right, thank you. And there's another question from Karim Sadek. Dr. Sadek asks, it might be that we have the notion of the ordinary human being or the prudent man, but we might disagree on what this notion is. Is it prudent to quit a secure job to pursue an adventurous life? And even if we agree on the notion of the prudent man, we might disagree on the place and role prudence should have in a human life. If so, then this undermines the significance of an agreement on the notion of the prudent man.
This is a very good question. Thank you. I believe that the person who posed the question realized that certain life choices are prudent, but they are not adventurous. So there is an agreement on what is the prudent course of action. But then we may decide otherwise. This is the beauty of free will. But since I'm interested in political and legal matters, I believe that the liberal state should be based on this very minimal notion of what prudence requires statesmen and lawmakers to do. And so the liberal state should have, in my opinion, simply this role of issuing laws which are rules of conduct. At the same time, since I believe, liberalism is a system of values, is an ideology in the old-fashioned meaning of the word, a consistent set of ideas, I believe that it is important that in our liberal states, we pursue a liberal education, by which I simply mean education in becoming a critical reasoner. So the opposite of indoctrination. Mm-hmm. And then we are free to make our life choices. And I think this is, the beauty of life as we know it, that we are all different. We know what is the prudent course of action, but we prefer to do something more adventurous. Only politicians should not be adventurers.
Yes. Okay. Let's see if there are any further questions. Right. Okay, for the moment, there are no further questions. Would you like to have anything in addition to say as a kind of a concluding remarks?
I would like to add something to my last answer, because I think that the question that was posed is very well argued and very provocative and goes right at the heart of my argument. What if this notion of the prudent human being too is relative to a time and a place and so cannot act as a guide? As I said, I find that it is impossible to have unanimity or even a majority of opinion about what is good in life, about our life choices, about, to use Kant's expression, our vision of happiness. I find the world beautiful because everyone has a different view of what happiness is. So, that said, I think that we still can find an agreement based not only on reasoning, but also on history about what we consider evil. So we cannot have agreement on what is good, but we can have agreement about what is evil and should be avoided at all times. This is my bottom line against the relativist, because the relativist always argues that, well, actually everything is up to debate. There is, I'm sorry for the sad and unpalatable topic, but there is a very interesting debate between Martha Newsbound, who is a radical liberal, almost a Marxist, and the Israeli intellectual Yael Tamir about female genital mutilation, where Tamir argues from a relativistic point of view, saying, oh, come on, this is a cultural practice. After all, American women do something similar with all the plastic surgery. And Newsbound replies very strongly against this relativistic attitude. So relativism, if it's taken seriously, leaves us devoid of a weapon to counter practices that I imagine we all find disgusting. This is the problem. And so I think, without recurring to Nussbaum's very sophisticated and well-meaning Aristotelian essentialism, we can find a solution in pointing that historically, no, I put it in a provocative way, why would we all, I speak also for the people in the audience, why would we all, after this talk, prefer to go out, have a good glass of Turkish wine instead of being slapped in the face? Oh, it is obvious. Well, for a relativist, it is not obvious. So my point was exactly this. We all agree that certain things should be avoided at all costs. This is the foundation of an anti-relativistic stance.
I see. Well, that kind of brings a question to my mind. Is it seems that, would it be correct then to say relativism is innocent insofar as it is not used as a means to an end? If relativism is understood as kind of an end in itself, which might be interpreted as the recognition that there are other points of view, rather than applying it to certain practices and using it as a means to an end. That's insofar as it is a means to an end, then it's somewhat innocent and a respectable thesis, perhaps.
I completely agree. And this is why I prefer to call that position in a different way, like pluralism, for instance, value pluralism. I know some authors speak of relativism in that sense. To mention one famous one, the most important legal theorist of the 20th century, Hans Kelsen, writes about relativism, meaning exactly what you've just said. The idea that there are no absolute truth, and this is respectful to people, and also this is liberal, because absolute truth lead to totalitarianism. I simply disagree. I agree with the content. I disagree on the word. I prefer to take relativism in the sense of Protagoras and call that value pluralism or some other way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. In the meanwhile, there's an actual additional question. Irem Elch asks, can we attribute an evil meaning to the notion of prudent men through the consent of the majority opinion?
This is a good question. And I said something about it, but evidently too much in passing. I think it is very dangerous, in fact, to construe the notion of the prudent man or the prudent human being simply based on the majority opinion of what most people think in a society. That is very dangerous. That is why, again, using a provocative language, I said that the prudent human being is every one of us when we are in our best behavior. Mm-hmm. So when we think, if you wish, in an Aristotelian manner, of what is good for the entire society, what is good for the way the pater familias thinks of his family and of the people he cares for. So I find that notion dangerous if it's simply based on what the majority of people think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Well, there are many who's thanking you for the presentation.
Oh, I'm glad. I hope I was clear. I know it is a difficult topic, and I know I deliberately use provocative words, provocative examples, and I cut some, to tell you the truth, because I wanted to stir the debate, because I really think this is an important problem, especially now with globalization.
Yes, yes. Very contemporary issue.
Yes. So my bottom line is that everybody historically has agreed that certain things are better than others. Health is better than sickness, for instance, to start with the example of the bodily condition. Mm-hmm. Or, being free is better than being a slave or incarcerated without reason. And being alive is better than being dead. I know these seem platitude, but I believe it is on these negative notions that we can build our answer to relativism. Mm-hmm. So it's not true that everything is up for decision and interpretation.
Okay. I think this is a good way to end the talk, actually, with this overall remark. Thank you very much, Professor Giovanni, for this enlightening, lovely afternoon with your talk. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me and for the introduction. It was a pleasure to be with you, to share with you my ideas, and I hope we will stay in touch. And please
Hopefully,
tell the students who were listening that if they have more questions that they thought of only afterwards, they can feel free to email me.
Great, thank you. We'll do that.
My pleasure. So have a very nice day. Bye-bye.